In Chapter 9, we're going to be looking at metabolic pathways that cells use to make ATP. We're going to primarily focus on cellular respiration, but we'll also talk about, well, if oxygen is not available for a cell to do cellular respiration, what other options do cells have? Okay. So we're going to use this particular slide twice. Once for cell respiration and once again for photosynthesis. And this image here reminds us how energy moves through an ecosystem. So in green, this box is our ecosystem. Remember that energy flows through as a one-way street, right? Energy comes in as light, gets used in the ecosystem, and then gets released from the ecosystem in the form of heat to go off into the great beyond, increase entropy of our universe. Now, what we've got in the ecosystem here is an example showing you how that energy gets used. So light energy, as it comes into our ecosystem, we as animals are unable to use it. We depend on photosynthetic organisms like plants to actually absorb that light energy. And what plants will do is they'll use that energy to take simple molecules like carbon dioxide and water, and through that boost in energy from sunlight and the use of their chloroplasts, they build organic molecules like sugars, like glucose, for themselves to use and for us to use as well. And they also produce oxygen. Now, these two products of this top process, which is photosynthesis, these two products actually become the two reactants for cellular respiration. So cellular respiration will use the energy stored in the organic molecules and the oxygen that's produced via photosynthesis, and through the use of a mitochondrion, the organic molecules get degraded. That's an exergonic process. Energy is released and used to make ATP, and then the end products of cell respiration are carbon dioxide and water. As the cell goes through and uses ATP to power cellular work, the energy that's used to power that cellular work, some of it is actually lost inadvertently as heat that dissipates from living organisms into the atmosphere and then is lost again to the great beyond. So we're going to look at this particular image one more time when we get to photosynthesis, but for this chapter, chapter 9, we're going to focus just on the bottom half of this cycle here. We're going to look at cell respiration. How do we use organic molecules in the presence of oxygen and the mitochondrion to make ATP, and then also release carbon dioxide and water. So as we do this, as we look at ways in which cells can make ATP, there are several options. And I've listed the three that we're going to look at in this chapter, some in more detail than others. And you'll notice that they're kind of separated, these three options. The top two are separated from the bottom one because the top two can really happen in both prokaryotes and eukaryotes, while the bottom one, anaerobic respiration, is really reserved just for prokaryotic cells. So in any case, these are pathways, metabolic pathways that cells can use to make ATP. Our first example here is aerobic respiration. This is where we break down organic molecules in the presence of oxygen, and this yields a lot of ATP. If oxygen is not available, some organisms have the ability to turn to fermentation. In this case, you only have a partial degradation of sugars to make a little bit of ATP, and this can happen again if there is no oxygen available. Both of these, aerobic respiration and fermentation, can take place in both prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Our last option here is reserved just for prokaryotes. This is a process that's called anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic meaning without oxygen. So anaerobic respiration is really nearly an identical process here to aerobic respiration, except instead of using oxygen to help drive this process, these prokaryotic organisms are going to use and consume some other compounds in place of the oxygen to help create that ATP. All right, now what we're going to do though in this chapter is we're really going to focus on this idea of cellular respiration. What exactly is cellular respiration though, right? On the previous slide, I listed aerobic respiration, fermentation, and anaerobic respiration as ways to make ATP. And now I'm throwing this term cellular respiration out there. Well, really, cellular respiration should include both aerobic and anaerobic respiration. But the way that we've started to use this term within the scientific community, we really, when we say cellular respiration, we're really meaning only aerobic respiration, or that metabolic process which makes ATP through the degradation of carbohydrates in the presence of oxygen. And so I'm going to continue sort of that nomenclature. Whenever I say cellular respiration, think that I mean aerobic respiration. And when we're talking about anaerobic respiration, I will actually say anaerobic respiration. And so as we talk about this process of cellular respiration, aka aerobic respiration, we're going to start at the very beginning, looking at how the pathway can take a glucose molecule and degrade it all the way down to carbon dioxide and water and release energy that can be used to make ATP. And this process is shown down here. This is something that you need to memorize or learn because I will be asking you, right? So you need to know the summarized chemical reactions. So C6H12O6, this is glucose. And so we use glucose in the presence of oxygen here, 6 molecules of oxygen. We can then degrade the glucose down to carbon dioxide. We make 6 of those molecules, 6 molecules of water, and we release energy. Most of that energy is actually released as heat, but some of it can actually be used to make ATP for the cell, so it has some sort of energy available to do cellular work. And when we study this process of cell respiration, we're going to start with a glucose molecule. Keep in mind that glucose is not the only fuel that a living organism can use to make ATP. Carbohydrates might be preferred, glucose, fructose, other carbs, but we can also use fats and we can also use proteins to make ATP. And so we will start out understanding the process of cell respiration using a glucose molecule, but then at the end of the chapter we're going to see, well, how could we, if we didn't have glucose available, use other carbohydrates or use fats or proteins to drive cellular respiration to make ATP for our cells.